Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 7, Society and its Reproduction. This is part 1 of lecture 7. Now, previously we discussed about individuals. We started with cells and organisms, and then we discussed more about the nervous system and in particular the mind in the last lecture. Now we move on from the individuals to multi-organism systems. We look at how social systems are organized. So in this lecture we will look at multi-organism systems. What does it mean to have these systems where the organisms are the communication units? Then we look at human communications in more detail, and we define human society as the system of human communications. So, we discussed about organisms, and we saw that they are multicellular systems, where we define the organism as a system of communication as the system of the intercellular communications. And we saw that the organism has a number of subsystems characterized by specialist communications. These are the tissues, where cells belonging to a tissue follow a narrower range of intercellular communications, a specialized set of communications. So, for example, the muscle tissue involves the muscle cells which interact, and those interactions are mainly about contraction and relaxation of muscles. Or the nervous system, where the neurons follow their own specialist interactions and interact mainly with other neurons, although they also interact with other cells of the organism. Now, the actions of the organism can be seen as sequences of patterns of intercellular communication. So, for example, the muscle cells interact, and also some neurons interact with other neurons, and some neurons with muscle cells, and a number of other cells are involved as well in order to deliver a limb movement of an organism, of an animal. Now, if you look at the perceptions, their environment actions on cells have an impact on the behavior of these cells, and that impact changes how these cells participate in intercellular communications, in the patterns of these communications. So that pattern changes, and those lead to the perceptions of the organism about their environment. So, for example, if you look at light perception, the light receptor cells interact with neurons. When they receive no light, there is a certain interaction between them, but when they receive light stimulation, that changes the how these cells behave, the photoreceptor cells, which changes how they interact with the neurons connected to them. And those changes in the interactions with the neurons change how these neurons interact with other neurons, and that leads to the perception of the organism about the visual environment around them. Now, the organism's actions have an impact on the environment. And this impact on the environment might be passed around through the environment, such that it induces some changes in another organism through the perception of these changes in the environment. So, for example, an organism may vibrate some membranes that generates a vibration in the air, which is effectively sound. That sound is transmitted through the air, and it induces a new set of vibration in another set of membranes of another organism. In this way, the sound produced by one organism is passed on through the air to another organism which perceives this sound. There are other ways of similar interorganism communications. These may involve the molecules which get passed on through the air, diffuse through the air, and reach sensory cells in the other organism. Or, of course, there are all kinds of light-based communications where an organism displays certain behaviors or certain colors on their skin or on their feathers or other covering of their bodies, and those patterns of behavior are perceived by another organism by perception of light reflected by the first organism. So there are many ways of inter-organism communication. Sometimes one animal may touch another animal and so on. Now, in general, each communication action or each behavior depends on the previous behaviors of the organism, and also on the behaviors of the organism that are impacting these behaviors of other organisms which impact this particular organism. So there is a referencing of previous behaviors of the organism and previous perceptions of the organism about the behavior of other organisms. So, for example, if you look at the courtship or fighting behavior of animals, you see examples of this. So, in courtship, you have certain patterns of behaviors that the animals follow, and the earlier behaviors of the animal and other possible partner animals determine what kind of next behaviors they do. Similarly, in the context of fighting, there are certain rules that animals follow, and actually a large part of the fighting, it is about producing these fighting behaviors, which themselves are not necessarily harmful for the other individual animal, but rather need to provide a way of communication about their intentions, strengths, and so on. And quite often, fighting behaviors are sufficient to conclude the fight itself by one individual submitting to the other or walking away from the possible fight. Now, so where this leads us is that you can see the organisms as communication units generating behaviors that are constituting communications toward other code-specific organisms. And in this context, we ignore what happens inside of the organism. So we are not interested in how these various behaviors are generated. We focus on them as communication units, abstract communication units, which generate these communication behaviors. And what we see is that there are frequent communications among code-specific organisms and much more rare communications with other kinds of organisms. So, for example, you may look at the community of dogs, where the interactions are mainly between dogs. Of course, they also interact with other animals like cats and also with humans. But most of the interactions are between dogs, consisting of the community of the dogs. Now, some of these systems that we can identify are relatively small. So, for example, courtship or fighting may last for a relatively short time, possibly minutes to hours, and may involve a relatively small range of behaviors which follow the rules of the system. Offspring raising is a much longer. It may last for days, weeks, months, possibly even years in the case of some animals. But again, it is a relatively small system involving a small group of animals, possibly just two animals, and it follows the rules of this system. Now, on the other side, we can also see large systems like ant and bee colonies or groups of more social animals. And of course, in human society, we see that there are many interactions between many individuals which follow these rules and which last for very long time, many years, possibly decades, centuries, millennia. Now, let's focus now on human individuals, because this is where we see the most complex social interactions among humans. So, what we said about humans is that these are organisms with many subsystems. They have the nervous system, which consists their information subsystem. And within the nervous system, they have an inner information subsystem which deals with the memories and the processing of the memories. You noted that humans have long-term memories, which are memories of processing of other memories. And we also discussed about the mind in human individuals, which is the core inner information subsystem of the nervous system, which is the system of conscious perceptions and intentional actions of the individual. Now, what we said is that the mind is this subsystem which is generated by the question of the who am I, this double contingency where the individuality depends on the environment, and it leads to this questioning of the existence of the individual and the questioning of the identity of the individual. Now, we said that the language of the mind is the language that the human individual uses to discuss about themselves, about the question of the definition of the I, what is part of the I and what is not. And the mind is mainly in a social context. So the question of who am I is answered and defined mainly in the context of interactions with other humans. Now, if you look at the nervous system of humans, obviously they have many subsystems, visual, auditory, motor, and other subsystems, which specialize in some particular area of behavior control or perception. And of course, they have the information subsystem, which is the memory processing of long-term and short-term memories, which we said that these are the associative subsystems. Now, associative subsystems is perhaps a relatively old term, but it really emphasizes that these are the areas which are not specialized neither in particularly in perception or behavior control, but rather integrate behavior control with perception and further processing. Now, these are the areas where memories are processed, and in particular the long-term memories are processed. As I noted earlier, it's a bit unclear where the mind as such resides in the brain. There are many areas which contribute to it. So far we don't know exactly where, but it is very clear that you need all of these associative areas to produce the mind as a subsystem of the brain in humans. Now, if you look at subsystems, there are two particular subsystems in the brain which are very important in the context of communications between humans. One is the Wernicke area, which is the language understanding subsystem. So this is part of the brain which allows humans to understand language produced by other humans and by themselves as well. And other is the language behavior production subsystem, which is the Broca area. Interesting, this is an area which is not related to the production of other vocalizations in humans, which are similar to animal vocalizations, but rather it is an area which is involved in the control of fine control of musculature. So indeed, that's what we need to produce language, very fine control of muscles in the throat and around in tongue and so on, in order to produce the right patterns of vibrations in the air, which are ultimately our phonemes that we use to produce human speech. Now, in animals, what we can see is mainly there is a behavioral language. So, for example, if you consider courtship or fighting, what you see is mainly body language, postures, and vocalizations, and a combination of these which deliver the communications between the animals. On the other side, in humans, of course, we have the behavioral language as well, like facial gestures, body language, kind of animal-like vocalizations. But in addition to these, we have the speech, which is a very specialized behavioral language, which involves this rich modulation of sounds, which we can use to combine birth and in general human speech, which allows a much broader range of communications between humans than compared to what is possible in animals. Now, if you look at animals where the communication between the individuals is mainly behavioral, what you can say is that these consider behavioral societies based on these behavioral communications. So, for example, if you look at ants, bees, monkeys, dogs, and other social animals, you see that there are certain behavioral communications, and those constitute the behavioral society. So we define these behavioral societies, for example, in the case of ants, it is the tapping of the bodies of ants, the leaving of pheromone trails, and leaving of other diffusible molecules which help ants communicate with each other, and also the tapping with antenna, which generates both touch and potentially auditory communications between ants. And the patterns of these constitute their behavioral society. Now, in the case of humans, as you said, the human language roots is in the processing of long-term memories. So the memories of behaviors lead to long-term memories of these behaviors, and the process of these long-term memories about which behaviors are correct, to what extent, and how they fit with other behaviors. And these communications about long-term memories lead to the human language. First of all, in terms of the internal communication about the identity of the self, and then to use these communications in terms of providing roots for the human language, which is a communications, the tool for the communications between individual humans. Now, this leads to a system of verbal interhuman communication. So these are communications of between humans which use human speech, human language to provide these communications. If you look at the structure of human communications, let's see, you have the words. These are sequences of phonemes. The phonemes are the basic units that we can vocalize in the context of speech. Then you have the sentences, which are the sequences of words which have some particular meaning together. And then the communications, which are sets of sentences. Now, if you look at the rules of these, what you see is that the rules of phoneme consecutiveness are very sharp conditional distribution. So here, when you use and generate phonemes, there are very strict rules of which phoneme may follow another phoneme to make a meaningful word. Now, the consecutiveness rules of the words are the grammar rules of the language. So for each human language, you have a different grammatical rule set, and those define how words in that particular language should follow each other. Some languages are more strict, while others are more relaxed about the ordering of the words in meaningful sequences. And finally, the rules of the larger scale communications are mainly semantic rules, which are the rules of referencing between sentences. As you speak, your sentences reference information that was communicated in the earlier sentences, and possibly you reference other general knowledge as well. And these semantic rules of referencing drive how you put together sequences of sentences in order to communicate. Now, as we said, human communications reference other human communications. They partly reference the communications produced by the same human, and also reference communications produced by other humans. And we see a dense cluster of communications where humans communicate and reference other human communications, and very rarely they communicate to other animals or reference communications to other animals. For example, communications with a dog. And what we say here is that society is defined as the system of all human communications. So here the individual humans are the communication units, and their communications constitute the society in the context of our approach of abstract communication systems. Now, the actions of the society are sequences of human communications that induce actions of humans on the environment. So, for example, if you call one of your friends who moves closer to you, that has an impact on the environment. Or building a house, which involves many human communications, has an impact on the environment. Similarly, taking the perception side, if the environment induces changes, induce changes on humans, they change their communications, and that leads to perceptions of the society about their environment. Now, for example, if you consider wildfires, when these happen, humans communicate about these, which leads to the escape of people in the area and the deployment of firefighters, which aim to stop the fire. So again, the environment has an impact on the human communications, and that leads to an action of the human society, which has again an impact on the environment. Meaningful communications are those human communications which reference other human communications and provide reference for others, so allow continuation to generate further human communications. These communications contribute to the reproduction and maintenance and expansion of the society as a system. So, for example, you may consider gossiping, which is passing around of more or less correct information, not necessarily always correct. However, it is a very important part of how society works, how it reproduces, and how it passes around the information, which leads to further communications within the society. Now, on the other side, the meaningless communications are the ones which cannot be referenced or sooner or later lead to situations where no further continuation can happen. Now, these communications are what paradoxes which cannot be interpreted in the context of the human society, in the context of the language of that human society. And it cannot be decided whether they are correct or not and lead to kind of undecidable situations. And here the correctness refers mainly to the semantic correctness, not to the grammar or phoneme order correctness, because these are much more sharply defined. Now, this leads to of course, to the concept of faults, errors, and failures. So, faulty communications are things which do not fit the rules. So, for example, rattlets. In English, this sequence of phonemes makes no sense. Or if I say cat the ate big the mouse, each word in this sequence of words has it's well formulated, follows the phoneme rules. But overall, the sequence of these words makes no sense as a sentence. Or if I say she was blonde with blue eyes, so it was running around the table and the cherries were really ripe. Now, this sequence of words has three parts. Each of these three parts separately look like making sense. However, all together, it is a sequence of half sentences which makes no sense. So these are senseless communications. They just don't fit either the phoneme consecutiveness rules or the word consecutiveness rules or the semantic rules of larger communications. In terms of errors, so these are the situations where communications follow all the rules, but the continuations do not happen as expected. So, for example, if a politician makes a big speech and the people, instead of cheering, leave the room quietly, That's a situation where the communications were formulated correctly. There was good, meaningful, coherent communication. However, the expected combination is missing. And finally, we can see failures in the social context. For example, if you consider a company, if the reliable communications are lacking in that company, in that organization, that lead to big performance and ultimately falling apart of the company. So if the accountancy reports contain errors, if the estimates about business plans, about marketing plans are unreliable, that organization will get weaker, their performance get weaker, and ultimately they may just fall apart. So, to summarize, in this part of the lecture, we looked at multi-organism systems. We said that each organism can be seen as a communication unit, and they generate behaviors which can be seen as communications between organisms. If these behaviors have an impact on the other organism, which is the receiver of the communications. And he said that the environment provides the transmission for these behaviors, or rather the transmission of the impact of the environment from the organism which generates these communications to the organism which receives these communications. And he said that these systems made of these communications between the organisms are the systems which lead to social systems. We said that in the case of animals, we can see behavioral societies and behavioral communication systems, such as courtship behavior, or, for example, the ant colony as a system of behavioral communications between ants. In the case of humans, we noted that obviously they have a nervous system with a brain, and they have the mind, which defines their identity, which leads to the use of this language, which is the language of self-monologue about the identity of the individual, which is mainly in the context of interactions with other humans. And this leads to the human language, which is used to communicate with other humans using human speech, which is very different from other behavioral communications that we can identify in animals. So human communications use human language and follow the language rules to deliver the human communications. And he said that the system of all these human communications constitutes a society. Now, as you see, for each language, we define a separate human society which follows the rules of that particular human language. Of course, we can see all these together as a global human society, which is much more valid today than, let's say, 1,000 years ago or more, 2,000 years ago, when the communications between different human societies speaking different languages were much more reduced than they are today. Moving on to the question and answers. Let's start with this first question. Is it true that the limb movement can be considered as a sequence of communication patterns between the cells of an organism? And the answer is yes. The limb movement involves a lot of muscle cells, neurons, and other cells around the muscle cells. And the interactions of these cells deliver this limb movement. So indeed, we can see the limb movement as a pattern of communications between cells of the organism. Second question, is it true that hunting a prey is a set of communications that constitute a communication system? Well, what we said about communication system is that these have to be observable over a long time, have to be reproducible, and have to reproduce themselves. Now, hunting a prey clearly involves certain pattern of behavior both on the hunter and the prey side. And these behaviors may be quite specific when a particular hunter and the particular prey is matched. However, overall, these systems do not reproduce themselves as a system. The hunter and the prey may learn from their experience, and they may use that experience to reproduce their behaviors in the future. In general, these systems do not reproduce themselves. They either end with the prey hunted and killed, or it's failure of hunting, which dissolves the system after a relatively little time, and any next instance of this potential system involves a different match of animals which may not really reproduce the same system. So overall, we don't see this as a communication system. Next, is it true that the communications between ants consider ant society or colony system? And the answer is yes. This is what we said. That in this case, you have the behavioral communication between the ants, the pheromones, the taps with the antenna, and these communications, behavioral communications, constitute together the ant society, where ants themselves are seen as the communication units. Next question. Is it true that the humans communicate within themselves about their own identity forming the system of the mind? And we said that in the context of our interpretation of abstract communication systems, this is how it works, that humans communicate about themselves, and this communication leads to the formulation of the system of the mind, which is the core memory processing system in the nervous system of humans, which deals with the intentional behaviors and the conscious perceptions. Next, is it true that there is no specialized brain area for the production of human speech? And the answer is that this is not the case. Indeed, there is the Broca area, which deals with the production of human speech, and this is a very specialized brain area which controls very fine muscle movements in the throat and tongue and other muscles around these organs. And finally, is it true that human language communications consider human society? And yes, that's how we define human society in the context of our interpretation, that the human society, it is the sum of all these human language communications between humans. And as we said, for each separate language, we can define a separate human society. And today, there is also a much more global human society, since individuals belonging to different linguistic communities communicate, and we have a kind of integrated human society across many language-specific human societies. Thank you.